Thank you very much, and good morning to you, Sakin.
So please take us through these rather strong views that you share about the possible or unavoidable demise of Eskom, and this despite what government says about turning around the power utility.
No, I simply don't believe that, and I think most people just don't believe that. Now, we've seen this before. South African Airways has been privatized for all practical purposes because they're not flying or hardly flying. The same is exactly happening at the post office. The post office is bankrupt. The post office is closing down. The private sector has taken over many of those functions that the post office used to do. The same is happening currently with Denel. They are bankrupt. They simply cannot survive financially. They need money. They're asking for money. The same is going on at Eskom. The same is going on at Transnet. In fact, the Transnet minister recently asked the private sector to come with some solution and private sector participation as well. That's going to happen. So what is gradually happening is that gradually the private sector is taking over those kind of services that the state is supposed to be providing. Can this be turned around? I really doubt that, because we don't have the political will to do that. So what is required to turn around Eskom, as an example? Well, we have at Eskom between 40 and 45,000 people that work at Eskom. Work is perhaps a strong word, that get paid by Eskom. I think that's a better word. The reality is that there are probably 20,000 people too many at Eskom. If this was a private sector company, they would have been put into business rescue. Tens of thousands of people would have lost their jobs. It would have been restructured. That means the assets would have been sold off. And we would have seen if we can make some of the assets, the remaining assets, see if that can be worked. I think there are many assets that can still work at Eskom, but the political decision that we need to make, and we have to be honest about this, is that we have to cut the head count. There are too many people at Eskom. The same goes for Transnet. Transnet, they are too, now currently they're demanding huge increases again. The politicians simply do not have the, I think, the political will to step in and say the reality is that Transnet, the cost structure of Transnet is just not sustainable. The same goes for Eskom, it's just not sustainable. But nobody is prepared to say this. We have to cut the cost. And the single most important cost is simply the wage bill. The wage bill is too high. And somebody needs to step in and say, listen, we cannot afford this. And I think, in fact, I would even go as far as saying that it's unfair that private sector, or rather civil servants, because Transnet workers, Eskom workers are civil servants. They don't work for a company. Eskom is not a company. Transnet is not a company. Post Office is not a company. Nominally, it is a company, but it's simply part of the civil service. They are civil servants. If it really was a company, they would have gone into bankrupt. They're not going to go bankrupt because you and I, the taxpayer, will keep on bailing them out. But that's the political question. Are the politicians prepared to do the inevitable and do what has happened to South African Airways? And that is that many thousands of people who will lose their jobs. That's just the reality of life, because those things are financially and operationally has been run into the ground. We need to fix that. And the only way to fix that is to cut costs. And the way that we need to cut costs is on personnel, because there are too many people. They are underworked and overpaid mostly. Not all of them, of course. Many people are overworked and underpaid without a doubt. So inevitably what is going to happen, the whole thing will slowly grind to an end. And eventually the private sector, if you want those kind of services, the private sector will have to provide that. That is really as simple as this. This is happening to all the other state-owned enterprises, and this is what's going to be, what's going to happen at Transnet as well, and that's what's going to happen at Eskom as well. In fact, it is already happening. The Minister of Energy Affairs, he's recently increased how much that the private sector can generate, 200 megawatts, for example, kicking and screaming. But eventually, if we want electricity, the private sector will have to provide that. That is the reality, and that's the end of this flick. That's how the whole thing is going to end. So while we have some say over this, why don't we manage it properly in that direction? Because that's where it is going to end. But unfortunately, in the meantime, the politicians simply, they keep on preventing the inevitable from happening, and it's costing the economy and it's costing the taxpayer far too much money. And the reason why they're preventing this from happening is because of politics. So South Africa's problems are not economical. We know that we've got economic problems, but it's easy to fix that. I've just given you the solution, how to fix the state-owned enterprises. The problem is politics. The politicians simply are not prepared to do what it's about. I mean, think about this. Transnet recently got an increase, the workers at Transnet, of 7%. How on earth can you give people an increase of 7% when the thing is bankrupt, it simply cannot afford it. How on earth can you expect us, the taxpayers, to keep on bailing it out? It simply does not make sense. And the reason why we allow this to happen is because of politics. It's because of COSATU being part of the tripartite alliance. It's because of the silly ideology that the ANC government is following. Those are the reasons, political reasons.
So let's just unpack that further, Dawie. So while you could perhaps argue very strongly that an entity like SAA, as many people would have said previously, can be seen as a vanity project for the country, it's not absolutely necessary. That goes down. It is heartbreaking for the people who lose their jobs,
yes,
the families who lose their livelihoods as a result of that. But when it comes to Eskom, I would like to argue that that is a different argument, because when it comes to the electrification and the services that are provided to ordinary South Africans, you cannot hand that particular issue over to the private sector. Because if you look at the cost of electricity already, as we speak right now, it's already unaffordable to many South Africans. Yes. So when you put that in private hands, it will become more unaffordable. So what are we then saying? Are we going to commodify electricity to a point whereby you absolutely have to be of a certain stature in society to be able to afford electricity? Because that is unacceptable. And that's where I will differ with you about the politics of this situation. I would argue that it's absolutely necessary that government remains a key player in this space.
Let's just go to your comment about heartbreaking. Let me tell you what is heartbreaking. What is heartbreaking is more than 1 million people lost their jobs in the private sector. Not one single civil servant lost their job. More than 100 million people lost their jobs. Millions of people are currently experiencing really hardship in South Africa. We have seen an increase in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty means that people are going to be hungry. That is real hardship. That is real. If you really want to talk about something that is that we need to be concerned about, it is really that. I can tell you, the average South African has been getting poorer for more than 10 years. This will continue if we don't fix certain things. Your question and your comment about the importance of electricity, of course that is true. But so far, the government has not been successful in providing those sort of services.
But is the answer then, Dawie, is the answer to privatize, or is the answer to fix it? Because we know Eskom can provide. We know that if that entity is run properly, Dawie, we have seen it. This was 20 years ago the best power utility in the world, not just in the country. And therefore, we know that if it is run correctly, if it is run properly, it can produce. We had the cheapest electricity in the world. We were able to sell to other countries. So why can't we fix that instead of privatizing it as the be-all and end-all? No, Sakina, I think you're looking at it incorrectly. You are basically, this is the ideological difference, typical arguments that are being made. And I do not have any issue with the state supporting people. And currently, the state is supporting 32 million people. Every month, 32 million people are getting an income from the state. On the other side, is the state good at providing electricity? No. Is the state good at providing services from Transnet? The answer certainly is no. So the reality is they have not been good to that. Basically, what you are saying, that we have to continue with mismanagement, with inefficiencies, while in the case of the private sector, it will be efficiency. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the opposite.
You can still support the poor. I don't have an issue with supporting the poor, but you cannot support the poor by artificially mismanaging things like, for example, Eskom. Leave that to the private sector. Let the private sector be efficient. Tax the private sector even if you want to, and use that money to support the poor. But the state has proved itself to be inefficient and incompetent in providing those kind of services.
And that is what I'm saying. I'm not saying we should continue with the inefficiencies, with the mismanagement of the entity. I am saying we have seen that this entity can be properly run. Why don't we find out what is bedeviling Eskom. What's bedeviling Eskom is the political interference. That needs to be taken out of the entity, and this needs to be run professionally because it has been done, it can be done again. When Eskom was conceptualized with Van der Bijl as the first chairperson of it, that was one of the conditions, that government stays out of it, and it was run by professionals. So why can't we harp back to that and fix the entity? Because when we talk about privatization, again, in a country with unacceptably high levels of unemployment, how are people going to afford this? And I'm just talking about one factor, which is unemployment at this stage, Dawie. How is it going to be affordable?
We haven't done it for 20 years. Are we going to start doing it suddenly now? I don't think so. And people won't afford it, won't be able to afford it if the economy doesn't grow. The economy is not going to grow. The South African economy is flirting with a recession right now. We're going to see a further increase in unemployment and poverty in South Africa. The taxpayers that can afford it, they are simply leaving South Africa. They simply can't afford this tax burden anymore. We have to make a decision here. We have to make a choice between efficiencies and incompetence and inefficiencies. And it's really, and I'm not saying that you have to go and exploit people. If you have a proper functioning market, in fact, the private sector will be far, far, far cheaper than the services provided by the state. Look at South African Airways. The South African Airways cost us something like 50 billion rand. And I know it's a vanity project, I know. But it's cost us 50 billion rand and it still doesn't exist anymore. It has been, for all practical purposes, it has been privatized. In the case of Eskom, it's costing us every year, the taxpayers, 30 or 40, 50 billion rand or so, and still they're making losses. It is in the process of being privatized. It is inevitable because of the incompetence of government. It is going to happen. And in the end, we will have electricity. It will be much more efficient provided by the private sector, and it will be cheaper, much, much cheaper than the current price that we are paying as an economy for an incompetent government.
Dawie, give me an example of where a state-owned enterprise has been privatized and the services or the price of commodities became cheaper. What happened to Eskom?
But that's not the point.
But it is the point. When you say...
A good example. Yes, a good example. I'll give you an example. South African Airways is an example.
Where's it cheaper?
South African Airways itself, no, not South African Airways itself, but the airlines in South Africa are much, much cheaper. There are many private sector airlines flying in South Africa, but they're not costing me money. They're not costing me money.
But it's more expensive at the moment for whatever reasons.
No, it's not more expensive.
But Dawie,
it is cheaper because they don't need my subsidy. They don't need my taxpayers' subsidy. And South African Airways needed subsidies every time in order to stay in the air. And even then they
But we are still paying as South African taxpayers for SAA.
And we're going to continue paying.
Exactly, so it's not cheaper. It's not cheaper.
But no, you don't understand what I mean. What I mean by that, flying in South Africa has become cheaper because the private sector is providing that. If you look at the flying, when it was under the management of the state, it needed money to stay in the air, and it needed money from you and I, the taxpayer. You don't include that in the price of airline tickets, for example.
How much has the taxpayer paid in the last financial year towards SAA, Dawie?
Not the last financial year, but they're asking for 3.5 billion. Do you know that?
I do know that.
Billion.
But how much did we pay?
Didn't
we pay some 10 billion rand? And we were told that these were latent from the previous transactions that was owing. So the taxpayer is continually paying. We haven't stopped paying.
We're missing each other here.
We haven't stopped paying.
No, we're missing each other here. What I'm saying is that you've got a choice between an incompetent civil service, where you have to keep on keeping them in business because of taxpayers' subsidies or support by the taxpayer, and think that they're providing cheap services to the people of the country. They don't, because the taxpayer keeps them alive. This the same with Eskom. Eskom is financially not functioning properly. That if without the taxpayer, Eskom would go bankrupt. It's a bankrupt company. The same goes for Transnet. Without the taxpayer, it's a bankrupt company. We could have used those taxes for far more important things. Why keep on propping up a bankrupt company? Get the private sector to run it. The prices might go up, but the lower prices, the lower cost to the taxpayer will be to the benefit of the economy in total in the end. And it will lead to strong economic growth, more job creation, less poverty in South Africa. The opposite exactly is happening at the moment.
So let's take a look, SAA, as the example that you quote. So SAA, the taxpayer has already forked out in excess of 50 billion, to be exact, in that particular effort. And then you bring on a private sector partner at the cost of 3 billion rand over 3 years. Now, in July, Nedbank chief executive says the government's plan to take over part of Eskom's 396 billion rand debt, is what he was saying, is in the right direction because, as he says, this power utility is too big to fail. And also considering all the money that we have already thrown into Eskom. So what do you say to that?
Well, it is failing anyway. Currently, Eskom is asking for 30 or 32, 36% increase. Eskom needs us to take over their debt, at least 200 to 250 billion. We need to take that over because they cannot survive financially. That is the reality. Eskom is going to make more losses. We've got load shedding all the time. It's affecting and impacting on the economy. That is the mess in which we are in. So fix it. And the way to fix it. And some parts of Eskom, I believe, should stay. Should belong to the state, like, for example, the transmission lines. That's a national monopoly. But the generation part, as an example, we need to give that to the private sector. We've got a choice. Either we get load shedding, cheap electricity, like in the old Soviet Union, everything was cheap. You could get bread and milk, everything was very cheap. You just couldn't get it. And that is the reality if you have a state that keeps on interfering with the economy. Everything is cheap, you just can't get it. And that is what is going to happen in South Africa as well. The reality is we are in a process of, we've already privatized South African Airways. The post office is being privatized as we speak. In fact, many other things have been privatized, and inevitably that is what is going to happen to Transnet. That is the reality. So why don't we manage it in that direction while we have still some control over that, because that is what is going to happen inevitably. But because of ideology, and because of a government that wants to keep on interfering in the economy with the silly ideas of developmental state, nothing happens, and the economy is grinding to an end. We are increasing unemployment and poverty, and we will do that again this year. And we will continue doing that until government changes track and realize that it's a private sector and not the state that can provide these services.
But Dawie, when you say the silly ideas of a developmental state, are we not a developmental state? Notwithstanding the fact that this developmental state is not well managed, that there's a lot that is wrong with the running of it, are we not a developmental state?
Well, we are a developmental state in the sense that we are supposed to be developing. But let's look at the things that really matters when it comes to developing, and that is your investment in your people. And the most important investment in your people is education. So we spend more on education than most people in most other countries in the world, absolutely, and in relative terms. And that's crucially important, especially primary education, or even before primary education. But the quality of our education is horrible compared to most other countries in the world. So start where it really matters and invest in your people and give quality investment in your people. But no, that's not what we want. What we want in South Africa is a government with their cadre deployment. They want to be in control of everything. They call it developmental state, but simply what they want to do, they want to be in control. This is about power, because they want to make sure that their people is in control of all the levers of the economy, and they can't do it. They've proved themselves not to be capable of doing that. So why want to keep on doing the same thing? There's something about Einstein saying about stupidity. No, we're being stupid in South Africa. Why keep on trying to do the same thing when we've tried to do it previously and it never worked before? And kicking and screaming, this government will eventually do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives, thanks to the minister from England saying that.
But perhaps the stupidity is continuing to pander to a system and maybe people in a system that continue to mismanage entities, as opposed to what you are saying. But Dawie, You and I can argue the whole day. So we're not going to do that because we've got other things to do. But it's been fantastic. Thanks so much for raising your views
Thank
with
you,
us.
Sakina.
And of course, the viewers will also let us know what their views are at Morning Live SABC. Director and Chief Economist at Efficient Group, Dawie Roodt, sharing his views that there's no other way to save Eskom but to privatize that state-owned utility.